Dr. Matt Brearley is Australia's preeminent occupational heat stress consultant, conducting and applying research to guide industry practice. He's the 2018 Exercise Scientist of the Year and holds a PhD in thermal physiology. And he has developed practical evidence-based procedures to maximize health, safety, and performance in the heat. So without any further delay, Matt, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. I just want to say that if you're like me, those bios make me cringe. So I had my mum help write that one for me, hence what it sounds like. I'm not sure. I'm not a big fan of them. But let's get this presentation started. Sorry, we'll just have to restart that.
Yes, we can see. That's good.
The presentation doesn't want to work. How's that?
It's working.
We're good. Apologies, everyone. IT is not my best suit. So session overview today, we're going to talk about the heat hangover, and I've cut it down into basically 4 discrete sections. I'm going to talk about heat and its impact seasonality, in a seasonal basis. I call that seasonality. We'll look at the heat stress symptoms that occur on a seasonal basis across various jurisdictions. Then I'll introduce the concept of this heat hangover, and right at the end, we'll look at how we can control it. So the next 20, 30 minutes, that's going to be our run sheet. So obviously Australia, big hot country. I'm going to start by talking about the north, an area where I've had a lot of experience and lived for 15 years until recently. So we'll look at the tropical area, and the tropical area of Northern Australia is an area that's synonymous with heat and humidity, such that it's a daily topic of discussion. This person even went to the extent of putting "it's hot" on their number plate. It's that topical. The Northern Territory News is the key publication within the NT, and back in 2016 there was a front page called Going Mango. For those people familiar with the term mango madness, they're referring to that. Those that aren't, it's referring to a going tropo concept, and I'll explain that a little further. We did some research, and the research showed that this mango madness concept, the concept that people in the top end of the NT who are exposed to heat and humidity constantly, both during day and night, during this October to December period, which is the harshest 3 months of the year, anecdotally change their behaviour. Some people will call it going mad, and the mangoes are fruiting in that time of the year. Hence it's called mango madness. So the term may not be familiar to some, hopefully it'll be familiar to you all after this session. And the research behind this confirmation of mango madness is presented here. So October to December, very harsh climate. You probably wouldn't expect that 50% of assault-related deaths or homicides occur during a 3-month period across the top end. More broadly, suicides or self-harm occasioning death, almost 40% of those occur during those 3 months. So remember, 25% of the year. So both of these mechanisms of death are well overweight. If you look at the wet season more broadly, which is still hot and humid, not quite as harsh as the initial 3 months, you're over 3 times more likely to be a murder victim during the October to April period, and almost twice as likely to commit self-harm occasioning death. So while you probably didn't expect to be talking or listening to someone talk about suicide and homicides, this is evidence that something very unhealthy is occurring in a climate that is very, very hot and humid. And the study was published, the reference is down the bottom, you can freely access it. And to publish it, we had to control for various factors. And so we looked at alcohol involvement, ethnicity, location of death. So was it in remote settings? Was it in town? And none of those factors were as strong a predictor as climate, and controlling for them all, we still got the stats 3.3 and 1.6 times more likely respectively. So I think there's a strong case that mango madness is real. Why would that be the case? Well, ambient temperature affects a lot of things. I'm going to talk about physical activity because this is an occupational session. And so look at the stats here. Varying the ambient temperature has a marked impact upon our ability to do physical work from 3 to 20 to 40 degree environments. You can see there's a change in our time to exhaustion at a set work rate. I think that wouldn't be a surprise to anyone. In terms of relative humidity, because remember up north, it's very humid as well. At a set temperature and varying the relative humidity, we have a stepwise decrease in time to exhaustion as well. The third factor, and often forgotten in my opinion, is solar radiation. Now, solar radiation here in watts per metre squared, if you're not sure what 800 watts per metre squared feels like in the top end region during December and January, they would get 800 watts per square metre by around 10:30, 11 a.m. on a clear day. And it would stay above that number until around 1:32 p.m. Again, on a clear day, cloudy events and rain weather affects those numbers, obviously. So solar radiation, again, independently influences our ability to do physical work. So the combination of the three, which are combined in that top end region, have a marked effect on our ability to do physical work. Solar radiation for me, like I said, I think it's a forgotten factor. I like to express it in a visual format. So here's a work site, two workers going about their duties. There's a Bureau of Meteorology weather station within 11 kilometres of this site. So we took the reading at 38.8 as published on the BOM website. We have a calibrated weather station proximal to these workers, just out of shot. It's giving us 44.2. And what we can't see is this infrared. And so with the help of a lens, we're able to see the radiation being emitted from various surfaces. So you can see the shaded surface to the left of the work on the ladder at 45.2, 48.4 below them, but in full sun, that metal surface is at 55.3. So solar radiation for me has a marked impact upon our ability to do work, and something that's not often captured because it is quite hard to communicate that through general Bureau Meteorology readings. In terms of these conditions having an impact upon sites, so we're saying there's a seasonal impact upon public health and some mechanisms of death within the top end region. Well, what about on work sites? What's happening there? So these are unpublished data from various clients, but one client based in that Northern Territory region has a seasonal impact in their data. So injury and incident frequency varies between what we call summer. So summer, it's really called a wet season, but for this presentation, I've called it summer. We've called it, defined it as October to March. So basically 6 months, and we've split the remaining 6 months into winter. And you can see a basic 5-to-1 on average ratio of injury and incidents per month during the summer period compared to the winter period. That's a market effect. In areas that aren't combining humidity in their weather conditions, just high solar and high ambient temperatures, this is in central Queensland, we see a bit of a different pattern, but similar to that, the January to March period, which is known to be the hottest, also has an overweight representation of injuries. These are no incident data, just pure injuries for this client. Based upon the available evidence in the literature, there is also a strong association between ambient temperature and workplace harm through workers' compensation claims, etc. So I think there's a fairly strong case that there's definitely a seasonality of harm, not only within our public health, but within the occupational health as well. If we want to explore that a bit further, I think the best place to start is to ask the workers, and what better place to start than asking them what symptoms they're suffering. On the survey in front of you there, you can see it's question 8 of a 20-question survey, and this one's just looking at symptoms. Symptoms are quite mild at the top of the page down to severe, and you can see across the top, never, rarely, monthly, weekly, or daily describes how often the workers experience these symptoms. Weekly and daily is what I'm interested in. We're looking at chronic effects, so the combination of the weekly and the daily percentages are about to be presented. So on the first study, this is a paper published last month, and again, it's open access, fairly available, and there's a QR code at the end of this presentation for you to link to it. This study looked at that build-up period in the top end, so October to December, hot, humid conditions. We found that 75% of the workers noted that they were thirsty during this time of the year, and that's not a great surprise, but the fact that 1 in 3 of the workers reported feeling fatigued due to heat, it's purely due to heat, and 1 in 5 reported headaches and feeling irritable due to heat is a bit surprising. These numbers are relatively high, and the symptoms are quite interesting as well. This is where the heat hangover kicks in, because if you look at the symptoms, thirst, fatigue, headache, and irritability, they're quite similar to the symptoms that might be experienced following alcohol consumption, to the point where you'd have a hangover. Hence, we call this a heat hangover. Now, this started in 2013. We're at a depot. Workers were coming back looking heat stressed. They were exhibiting some aggressive behaviours. There was an uncomfortable feeling within the depot. And so trying to capture objectively how these workers are feeling while we're monitoring their core temperature, etc., we'd simply ask them. And the workers would report these type of symptoms. And I jokingly commented to one worker, "Wow, sounds like you're hungover," as a joke. And the response was quite passionate. The worker identified that that's how they feel every afternoon when they get back to the depot, and that they can't drink alcohol during the week because they simply feel hungover already. And so the crew were quite passionate in communicating how big a deal that was. And so hence the heat hangover started at that point, and we've been researching it ever since. I wanted to present an image to you what the heat hangover might look like. Now, I don't know what you're thinking in terms of the heat hangover, so I've just thrown this out there. We do not see this image at the depots. We do not see it. However, during anecdotal discussions with friends and family of people exposed to heat in the workplace, because we do run sessions for partners and family members in some really, really hot heat exposed mines, this is what they report. They report workers coming home with those symptoms that were on the previous slide, often not being very usable in terms of interacting with their partner, interacting with the kids. They talk about just wanting, the workers just wanting to be isolated and not interact, and often simply staring into space or falling asleep quite early, even before dinner, even before they've had a chance to have any opportunity to relax and have some of their own personal time. Another thing that captured our attention when dealing with the workers is that the onset of these symptoms are typically towards the end of or following the shift, which is similar to how a hangover from alcohol eventuates. It doesn't happen necessarily during the alcohol consumption, it happens post, and the heat exposure happens early in the shift, towards the middle of the shift, and the workers are paying for it towards the end. We think the heat hangover is a pretty good descriptor of what's going on in these workplaces. In terms of what happens when you have this heat hangover, we've again done the stats, and again, this is all published, so if you want some more information, grab the paper. But those workers that identified the symptoms on the previous slide, we call them the chronic symptom sufferers, they were 6 times more likely to report that they slow down when they're exposed to heat than the workers who didn't report those symptoms. And not only were they 6 times more likely to slow their speed of task completion, they're almost 3 times as likely to deliver an inferior quality of work. Now, these are self-reported by the workers. We haven't had an opportunity to do measurements on quality of work and speed of task completion in a valid manner in the field. We can do that in the lab, but not in the field. But self-reported, they're quite high. And so there's big implications of this heat hangover and these heat hangover symptoms for getting the job done and overall productivity. Let's have a look at another subset of data. This is again from hot and humid, but it's no longer looking at the build-up or the mango madness, it's looking at the wet season more broadly. When you look at October to April from this heat acclimatized group of workers who are field-based, you see a different pattern, but very, very similar. And so we haven't looked at thirst. Thirst is dealt with in a different question on this survey. So rash has made it into the top 4. But again, you're looking at almost 1 in 3 down to around 1 in 5 workers reporting these symptoms on a weekly or daily basis. I want to show you the negative impacts that these workers are reporting. So 1 in 3 workers are reporting sense of well-being is impacted by heat. Family relationships for almost 1 in 3 workers. I think there's some pretty serious side effects here of this heat hangover, not to mention the general ability to sleep or eat, which are just part of daily life, also being impacted. So for me, I think once we started to get a handle on this, and especially in the last few years, we've really been able to quantify the impact in certain subsets, obviously not across all of Australia, but we've been able to quantify the impact of heat exposure. And it's very clear that heat is no longer just purely a workplace issue for heat exposed workers. They take that heat home, they take the side effects of that heat exposure home, and it's impacting their inner circle, so the family and friends after work as well. The last one on symptoms, this is Southeast Queensland. Now, I would have expected Southeast Queensland during October to March. We call that a warm, humid climate, subtropical. Definitely not as harsh as some northern regions, but we've got the highest stats we've ever had. So we've never had 43% reporting fatigue in any other group, 1 in 3 reporting headache, irritability. The numbers are very, very high for the Southeast. So this paper's been submitted, and we really had to work hard to understand what's going on here, because within the same organisation, their northern region workers were not reporting the same pattern of symptoms. So we thought perhaps one of our earlier papers that was published in 2016, again, there's a link to this one towards the end, perhaps this explains it. So we looked at a group of firefighters on an urban search and rescue mission, a 24-hour exercise monitoring their physiological variables. And we had a group of Queensland and Northern Territory firefighters. This was done in mid-November, and we assumed that we'd have a group of less heat acclimatised workers coming out of Queensland compared to their northern counterparts. When we look at the data, we've got black dots representing core temperature of the northern region, so we call them heat acclimatised workers, and then you've got the white dots representing the Queensland or less heat acclimatised workers. And these were specifically from Southeast Queensland. Now, there's a divergence in the core temperatures around the 80 to 100 minute mark of this 24-hour exercise. This is despite both groups reporting that they felt hot and uncomfortable to the same degree. Basically, a 0 to 13 point scale, both groups were 10.1 or 10.2. It's quite clear that the workers are undertaking their duties according to how they feel, and it's the Queenslanders who started pacing their effort at around the 38.2, 38.3 mark, where the Northern Territory group kept pushing up towards the higher 38s. I think there's a clear effect of heat acclimatisation in this data here, in that the workers who are routinely exposed to heat and humidity are able to operate at a higher core temperature than those who aren't. Hence the symptom data coming through from the Southeast Queensland group. Some of the workers reported being caught out by the fluctuations in temperature and humidity, whereas up north it's relatively constant. You know it's going to be hot today, and you know it's going to be humid. We think this data set here helps understand the symptoms coming through from Southeast Queensland. In terms of this heat hangover, what is actually driving it? I think core temperature is a key. Here's an example core temperature data set from an underground miner. So no solar radiation within this data. However, the deep location within the mine means that the rock surface surrounding is at 45 to 46 degrees. So there is still a lot of radiant heat within that environment. Now you can see that the worker here has had an episode where they've reached 39.1 around the 300 minute mark. I'll give you some context to that. So the green area represents a core temperature that is acceptable based against any occupational standard, including ISO 9886. So our ideal core temperature across the shift would be under that green upper band. In terms of the amber zone, 38 to 39, once you cross 38 degrees, a lot of workers report a transition from feeling slightly uncomfortable to feeling proper uncomfortable, up to 38.5, feeling very uncomfortable, and 39 is not a temperature that you would sit at where you had full control of what you were doing. You would not attain a core temperature of 39 degrees if you were undertaking duties in your own backyard, gardening, etc., without any time pressure. It's simply a condition that's not compatible with sustained work. The red zone is obviously towards a heat stroke. That is where we must keep our workers out of this zone. And you can see we stopped the worker in blue here at the 39 degree mark. He actually went to 39.1. Immediate cooling, we did everything right and addressed that issue. There's a grey zone here, however. So where workers are being monitored and there's a medical team in close proximity, workers may be able to continue working in this zone. However, I think for 99% of conditions, we'd keep them out of under 38.5 where possible. So within that context, let's have a look at the worker represented by the green curve. So all attention was given to the worker in blue to address this abnormally high core temperature. However, the same level of care was not granted to the worker in green because they never breached that 39-degree cutoff. They did, however, breach that 38.5-degree cutoff on 5 occasions. If you look at this from an area under the curve point of view, you can see that the green area is much greater than blue. It's actually 37% greater area. And it's very interesting to us that the blue worker went home without any symptoms based upon this afternoon of a relatively low core temperature. However, the worker in green went home with a raging heat hangover, a very, very strong heat hangover. Coming back to work, they actually reported similar symptoms coming through the turnstile for their following shift. And they asked him, I said, just in one word, explain how you feel. And he said, empty. I said, empty? I said, what do you mean? He said, I just feel washed out. And it's exactly how he looked. An ashen appearance, bloodshot eyes. He looked like there wasn't much left in the tank. It's our understanding at this point, we haven't published this yet, but we've got a lot of data to suggest that the greater the area under the core temperature curve, the greater the symptom prevalence. And the greater the symptom prevalence, the greater the disparity in seasons with their injury and or incident data. So from our point of view, it's this core temperature that's driving the symptoms, driving that heat hangover. It's a heat hangover that's driving harm within the workplace. But we're not saying that it's high core temperatures that are driving harm specifically, because it's not our understanding and it's not our observation that high core temperatures equal harm at that point. But we do believe there is a carryover effect with this heat hangover. And we're actually seeing a lot of incidents that are occurring while we're monitoring, and workers will generally have a relatively low core temperature. However, they've had previous shifts where their area under the curve has been quite substantial. So we don't think there is a simple correlation between core temperature at a given point in time and harm, but we do think the summation of that heat exposure resulting in that core temperature would go a long way to explain the symptom prevalence. I hope I explained that sufficiently. In terms of correcting it, if that was correct, then you would be able to reverse some of these symptoms by lowering the core temperature curve across the work shift, which would require a change in how we do work. Ideally, we'd still be able to get the job done with short rest breaks only, and the rest breaks would be aggressive cooling, maybe a combination of air conditioning and other factors. So you can see here air conditioning. This is from one worker who got up to 39.2 degrees. We looked at their core temperature transition while in a 22-degree cooling refuge. So an air-conditioned room by themselves, limited airflows, pure air cooling. And you can see that there's around a 0.2 to 0.3 decrease for every 5 minutes that they spent in that cooling chamber. Ideally, 5 minutes would not be long enough. Our advice would be to turn around this heat hangover. You'd need routine entries into there of around 10 to 15 minutes. Workers are concerned that dropping 15 minutes of a 1 or 2 hour period might be unproductive. However, working at a high core temperature is very unproductive and may not just be unproductive on that shift, but for the following shifts as well. We've been able to prove to them that regular rest periods while undertaking aggressive cooling, not just resting in the shade, has been more than effective in terms of getting the job done. Another strategy that may be able to be implemented, and I'm just mentioning a couple here that they really need their own webinar to explain all the methods available, but the ingestion of ice is another quite practical method. Here's a group of 25 firefighters in the control group. You can see before their 20-minute bout of work, they're at a relatively low core temperature. They attain 38.9. After their work bout, they will exit the fire scene, drop their cylinder, and they'll re-enter after 20 minutes. This group here had access to 19-degree ambient conditions and a cold drink to get down to 38.1. the slushy group, another 25 firefighters, replicating the same starting temperature and hitting 38.9 as well. And their 20-minute workout were able to drop their core temperature back down to where they started simply by substituting the drink with a large bolus of slushy. So we're not saying that you shouldn't drink fluids and you should only drink slush, but in this study, we showed that for 20 minutes in 19-degree aircon and a slush, we're able to remove this amount of excess heat here. And imagine being able to go back into a fire scene at the same temperatures which you started after one cylinder. It would be quite a powerful feeling. In this study, the water immersion was only up to the navel, and so it was basically lower body water immersion in a kiddie's pool at 15 degrees. And while it did extract a good volume of heat, it wasn't compatible with the amount of heat removed by the slush. So summing up, I think the three key takeaways from this webinar are that the seasonal symptoms are very common. I think they're far more common than we understand. I think if we ask the workers directly through an anonymous survey, they're willing to be honest. I think if we ask them in front of their peers, they're less likely to state how they actually feel. Heat, the effects of heat can be buried within the body. We can put on a brave face and relate to our peers that we're bulletproof and that heat doesn't affect us. But when asked in a systematic manner that's anonymous, we get a high prevalence of symptoms. We think that reducing the area under the curve would be key to reducing the frequency and severity of those heat hangovers. And there are some cooling methods that exist. I've just touched on two. There are many more. And I haven't discussed all the negatives that come with some of these cooling methods, but I think the trialling that we're doing at the moment to reduce this core temperature curve is well worth it, and I urge others to do the same. If you're after more information, you'll receive these QR codes to chase up some of the papers, and there's many more that I haven't put the QR code up for, but they're referenced throughout and all open access. And we also publish a heat stress e-bulletin, which the next one, which will be number 18, will be either out over the weekend or early next week. So if you're keen, go to the website and sign up. The details are here. That concludes the webinar. I look forward to addressing some of your queries.
Thank you, Matt. All right, so I've got one question at the moment from Jason. He has asked, does Dr. Brearley feel that the wet bulb method of measurement is an accurate representation of when temperature humidity reaches dangerous levels for workers?
It's a great question. I think wet bulb is a good environmental measure. The issue I have is that each worker will have a different threshold at which that wet bulb is appropriate for them. So if we have a wet bulb set at, let's say, 32 degrees for modifying our work practices or implementing controls, that may be too early for some workers and maybe too late for others. If we do have a set standard on site, we tend to see that workers will rely on that as opposed to relying on how they feel. And so workers that are suffering symptoms will wait until that trigger occurs before addressing it. That's an issue for me. So I like a mixture of having a threshold, but I definitely like having workers have the access to do whatever practices they need to manage their heat stress. And for some workers on some days, that will be well before a given threshold.
Okay, Mark has said, great presentation, Matt. Are you working with companies on heat management strategies?
Yep, that's what we do. We try and guide practice with evidence. And so we only publish a little bit of the work we do, but we try and collect data from every work site to a research level so that we have an understanding of what's happening within that workplace. You may, if you're like me, I grew up in a warm area and everyone had an opinion on heat, and it's quite easy to go into workplaces where that's the case and I'll say, we should do this, what about that? And some workers will say, well, that doesn't happen here. But when you do a survey or you collect some data, you can actually say, well, 38% of the days it actually does happen here. I think that really does assist. So yes, we do collect evidence to drive industry practice.
Okay, Mark has also said a lot of organisations have complicated trigger action response plans. Do you think we should be looking at a simpler way of doing things?
Yes, we just completed one in Central Queensland where the client wanted as simple as possible, which is good. because I'm not a fan of the complicated ones. We didn't put in a trigger with a temperature or wet bulb or any environmental cutoff. We looked at the seasons and we looked at when it's going to be hot, and because it's so predictable, we had a trigger of the season being the month. So the month of January, we know it's hot, we will have these controls in place for our workers. We're not going to wait until it hits whatever it is, 38, 40, 42. We're going to have those processes and practices in place at the start of shift, irrespective of the temperature of that day, because it's likely to be hot at that time of year.
William has asked, how useful is WBGT in Darwin for managing occupational exposure?
Again, WBGT is an okay environmental measure. It's all about at what level do you implement the controls. I think these measures are okay at representing the environment, but again, I prefer a workforce that were free to use methods as they see fit, and that we'd have evidence-based cooling methods to allow them to get the job done. So I think WBGT is okay. I'm really not a great fan of its work-rest ratios and the amount of fluid you should drink based upon them, because I guess we just are all different. And the data shows that we have such divergent core temperature responses that I get quite uncomfortable by having such, I guess, such prescriptive responses based upon climatic conditions. It worries me.
Okay, Terry says, is there research on the drier heat experienced in Victoria?
Yes, we actually do a lot of research through Central Australia and the Pilbara. Haven't got any of the survey data from Victoria, but we've definitely got drier climates, and Central West New South Wales as well. So yes, we do have that data. I didn't present it here, but it's available. Similar responses, you'd be amazed. We have a group of workers in Northern Territory, so the top end, and then in Central, and the stats are very similar despite the divergent conditions. And we think those workers are acclimatised to their given conditions. And on those hot days where it's hot, dry, hot, wet, we're seeing similar symptoms. We do see more headaches in the hot, dry weather, which we're trying to get our head around at the moment, but pretty much everything else is very similar.
Kirsten asked, is there any research around preparation for the heat exposure rather than just focusing on the recovery aspect?
Yes, very much so. A lot of those cooling methods are used in the pre-cooling context. So I guess there's a lot of jobs where we know our workers will suffer heat from them. And so pre-cooling is a great way of opening up that heat storage window and going into the conditions and getting the job done at a cooler core temp. But more broadly, heat acclimatization is massive. It's an underrated tool for preparing our workers for the heat. So we spent a fair bit of time assessing heat acclimatization and coming up with various guidelines. We think it's underrated, and we definitely see an impact on the first few shifts for FIFO workers coming back to the hot weather. So I think it is an underrated tool for preparing our workers for heat.
Mark asks, what is the best heat management example you have seen in the field?
Oh, it's the ones we do, obviously. But on a serious note, I think there's a couple of groups we work with where the workers are just so empowered. I think all the workers we work with want to get the job done. I don't think there's any loafers out there that we work with. And so empowering them with all the cooling methods has been amazing. So a group, they'll have access to ice ingestion, shade shelters, cooling refuges. They may have a portable cool room, or may be on a trailer, or it may be a drivable, like a Mercedes-Benz van. And so have all this set up. Workers will go hard. They'll have a high heat storage rate. Definitely core temperatures rise quite quickly, but they'll dissipate that heat by rotating through a cool area. They'll have their ice available. They won't skip their meals. There's adequate hydration. And the job just gets done. And it's hard to measure productivity, but in the jobs where it's been trenching, and they'll have a goal of getting 60 or 70 metres of trenching done and cable laying per day, we've seen market increases where the crews have had access to all of the strategies all of the time, as opposed to having a trigger and bringing them in just on the really hot days. So I think access to cooling methods for me is the key to a really good quality heat stress management program. And the second point is the freedom for workers to use it, and no stigma amongst the workforce for using it.
Tony asks, is there any data on the benefits of electrolytes on the heat hangover effects or strategies for their use?
Oh, I thought I was going to get away with not talking about electrolytes, but no, Tony, I haven't looked at it. To be honest, I just want to mention that I have an issue with electrolyte beverages being promoted as a savior in heat stress fields. We know that food is our primary source of electrolytes, or ought to be, and that drinks such as Gatorade, Squincher, Thorst, Powerade, etc., are sold on the basis and marketed on the basis that they replenish their electrolytes. Look at all the ads and look at two terms: electrolytes and replenish. They're in almost all of the company's ads. But unfortunately, there's relatively low levels of electrolytes in those drinks, and there's relatively high levels within our food. And unless you are, I'll give you an example where you need electrolytes during your work shift. It's where you've skipped a meal, maybe breakfast. You've sweated profusely over an 8-hour period, so maybe a litre, 1.2 litres per hour, and you're drinking profusely and it's pure water. You're likely to be marginal on your electrolytes. But if you don't skip your breakfast, then it's almost job done. I have no dramas with workers having access to these fluids. I just want them to know that it's basically flavouring with a tiny amount of electrolytes in it, and that their food will dominate the amount. So I don't see electrolytes reversing the heat hangover unless someone is electrolyte deficient.
Thanks. Now, Helen has just said she got called away. Any chance of getting a copy of the webinar? I did mention earlier that we will send a video link and a podcast link tomorrow. And by the way, the podcasts are great for those people who just haven't got the time to sit there. So you can go for a walk or listen
What
in
could
the
be
car.
more important than the heat hangover podcast? Come on.
All right. Garth asks, hey, Matt, great presentation. Has there been any research into individuals' health and therefore how they respond to core temperature-wise? For example, I'd expect that a 140 kg muscle man would increase temperature more rapidly than a lean 80 kg person.
Yeah, your example there is talking about body shape and size, and you just basic thermodynamics has given us some insight here. So think of a solid brick, like a very big brick versus a cylinder. The cylinder will have a greater surface area to dissipate heat from it, and likely to have less mass. And so you think of a large, muscular, 140 kilo person. So there is surface area, but it's in a smaller ratio than for the leaner 80 kilo person. So there is a role for that, but underlying all of this is the individual response anyway. So I'm happy to share a paper done by Defence Science Technology colleagues of mine, brilliant researchers, looking at the divergent responses amongst military recruits and how some soldiers can do a pack march and not be symptomatic and have a low core temperature. Others will have symptoms with a low core temperature. Others will have a high core temperature, no symptoms. It really does a great job of explaining the individual responses we also see on site. So it's highly individual, but based on basic thermodynamics, yes, a muscular, heavy-set type of worker of limited stature may have issues in dissipating heat.
Okay, Mark asks, is there any evidence that wearing of cooling vests are of benefit?
Cooling vests are best used while doing work. So they depend upon the volume of ice, the phase change material, and the surface area, etc. They can play a role in limiting or blunting the rise in core temperature. Our research, which is submitted, it's yet to be accepted, we'll get it done, shows that the one we used was not useful in rest periods. So very good during work periods, but not good in rest periods. Same as resting in the shade up in the tropics. So you may as well just rest in the shade or hop in a cool room as opposed to using it based upon our evidence. And the issue for me is that, well, what do we do once these things heat up? How do we recharge them? Do we have individual containers? Do we throw them all in an esky or mixing body fluids? It's probably unhygienic. So there's a few issues in the practical implementation, but based upon the research, wearing them during work is the best way to go.
Okay, Roy asked, do we know the timeframes when the heat hangover symptoms start to dissipate without any interventions, as some staff may return home and have different access to cooling controls?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we're studying that at the moment. I think it was the second data set I showed. We've got all the data on strategy use at home, aircon use, slushy use, alcohol, etc. It is a mixed bag. It's definitely a mixed bag. We need to do a proper, it may even be a lab-based research project to look at the washout period of the heat hangover. So I don't have data on that at the moment. The only data we have based upon that question would be that the greater the area under the heat, greater the area under the core temp curve, the greater the heat hangover likelihood, and the longer that worker would need to wash that heat hangover out. So from my point of view, someone suffering several heat hangovers in a row, it's unlikely that they'll be able to wash that out in less time than it took to develop it. So if you had 2 or 3 days of heat hangovers in a row, I don't think you can wash that out in a day. I really don't. The evidence shows, well, the evidence we have is pointing towards it being a similar washout period. So basically 24 hours to wash out 24 hours of heat hangover as a minimum.
Okay, Peter asks, with the studies conducted were workers in standard PPE, cotton drill, and any evidence for workers in more significant PPE, e.g. chemical suits?
Chem suits, we've got some data from Ebola responders and medical teams, etc. We haven't got heat hangover data because they're basically doing very short shifts, and we weren't doing a longitudinal study on them. We've got a lot of the heat hangover data has come from arc flash and fire resistant PPE wearers as industry is transitioning, especially the electrical utility industry, which we work heavily in, is transitioning to that PPE. So we've got a lot of data from those groups, and some of the data presented was purely from arc flash and fire resistant clothing. It's anecdotally, based upon feedback from the workers, having a big effect. It's hard to see that in the core temp data. It's very, very difficult because the workers may be limiting their work rate and just getting the same core temps both with the pure cotton and the new uniform. We're not seeing it in the core temperature data.
Okay, Jason says, we currently have posters displaying signs of heat stress for workers to use as a guide when assessing colleagues. We also hand out ice blocks that are basically like Powerade in a nice format in conjunction with regular rest breaks and job task rotation. We also have air-conditioned sheds available for workers who suffer from heat stress. Is there anything else we could be doing?
Oh, yeah. That's a big webinar. Right there are, but it sounds like you're on the right track. It sounds like you're probably in front of others in terms of having access to the cooling. So I think that's great. I think those cooling areas, the cooling refuges are key. And I'd say to anyone who's listening that where workers are given the power to jump into a cool area for 10 or 15 minutes and not have a stigma and not be called soft and whatnot, that the productivity increases, the drop in core temp, the less likelihood of these heat hangovers. I think that's huge. And from there, we can do other strategies. We can have the icy poles in there. We can have them out in the field, etc. But the ability to hop in there without the stigma, I think, is a real key component of a good heat stress policy. So the fact that you've got those facilities and workers may be able to use them, I think that's a key part. There's lots and lots of stuff to be done, but yeah, I think that's an important point.
Okay, Kirsten said, thanks, Matt, excellent presentation. But we have got quite a, well, another like 5 or 6 questions. Are you okay for another couple of minutes?
I'm good.
Okay. Alicia says, what are your thoughts on requirements to wear full cover clothing, PPE, to prevent UV exposure versus the effects they cause in regards to heat exposure and increased core temperature?
What a question. It's a fantastic question. It's a question that I'm a thermal physiologist, so I basically study human response to heat, and I know that if we wrap the body up, that will limit radiation of heat from the body, and we're going to impair body heat loss. There's no question about that. Obviously, we don't live in an ideal world, and we're not going to wear singlets and shorts to work. So we've argued the case in boardrooms. We've had lawyers up against us, etc. Not that we've been charged, but the company is looking at the pros and cons of wrapping up their workers. And the lawyers are worried about future litigation from UV exposure and the resultant skin cancer. Now, one of my parents had skin cancer. I grew up in a household where you were physically accosted if you did not cover up your skin and have every protection method. So I'm well aware of that. However, we've got to find this balance because it's increasing the likelihood of heat stress, and a lot of companies are just putting in a blanket longs, even for workers in a warehouse, etc. That's the uniform we wear, and whether you're out in the field or whether you're immune from solar radiation, that's what you're wearing. So I see these pockets of workers caught up in a policy that just doesn't seem to be based upon evidence. I do support longs out in the field. I'd really like that uniform to be high quality, to be as thin as possible to allow heat to transmit through it, but also protect the workers from UV. But I do think we need to look at it on a case-by-case basis, and I think the lawyers are really dominating this space within boardrooms.
Okay, Chad, similar thing. Can a percentage of fatigue hangover can be attributed to longs as PPE?
Yeah, it's hard to attribute a percentage, but I think our core temperature response is partly due to the clothing we wear. So, yeah, but you might say that we wear short shorts and we just work harder and we still get as hot and we still have the same heat hangover. It's hard to know, but having less skin covered would give you a greater window to dissipate heat and limit that core temperature rise. I don't want to sound like I'm pushing to go back to short shorts. What I'm pushing for is great material to cover our workers in. Material that does allow transmission of heat, but does protect us from UV.
Okay. Simon says, have you experienced with the necktie products that you can soak with water?
Yeah, we don't use them. We look for methods that bring about a marked decrease in core temperature. A lot of the products decrease skin temperature and make us feel better. About 50% of how you feel out in the heat is due to your core, and roughly 50% your skin. It might be 70-30 for some workers, but generally it's around a 50-50 mix. Hence why pouring a cold bottle of water over your head feels awesome for a little bit. And then your core temperature doesn't move and you go straight back to being hot again. So we look for methods that bring about a large change in core temperature, and the necktie products don't do that. That's not to say you shouldn't use them. If something makes a worker feel better out in the heat, I don't have an issue with that. But I'm going to focus our efforts on the bigger gains.
Okay, Mark is making the point. It's great to see a scientific approach taken on preventing injuries that occur during the peak of summer. Traditionally, safety interventions are based on the unsupported belief that workers hurt themselves because they are distracted due to the Christmas period. Couple more questions. Martin, is there any research into the long-term health effects of exposure to high thermal temperatures?
Brilliant question. I've wondered this for many years, and the answer is no. Now, in Thailand, they looked at a cohort of around 50,000 workers who completed surveys, and it seemed that there's a bit of an effect there. They looked at workers chronically exposed to outdoor heat, and they found that they are twice as likely to have kidney issues as the broader population. I think kidneys would be a hotspot for assessing any accumulation or long-term exposure to heat as a key starting point. I think liver and brain, given that they're heat sensitive during a heat stroke event, might also be areas of concern. I've got a feeling that workers chronically exposed to heat do pay for it in the long term with their health. There's trends to show that workers living in tropical regions have a shorter lifespan, but there's lots of factors at play there. There's a lot at play. So it's hard to know. What I'm leaning towards is there's something there, but I don't think it's that apparent, that it's visible without us mining through a lot more data.
Okay. Kirsten asks, has any of your research involved aluminium smelter workers?
No, we haven't looked at this smelter crews.
Okay, Mark says, has there been a rise in wearables across industries, and are these an effective way to monitor personal heat exposure?
We've played in this space because the pills, we want a core temperature via a pill. It's invasive, it's expensive, it requires us to be there I'd rather do it remotely if we had the opportunity to. So we've evaluated a lot of wearables and we'll continue to do so. But I'm being a scientist, I'm just really not confident in the numbers that I get from them, and the prediction of core temperature on every device that I've ever seen just does not replicate core temperature. So I'm quite conservative and won't collect any data unless I know it's real. And so we're not there yet. I'm hoping we get there soon, but we're not there yet, in my opinion.
Andrew said a t-shirt's always cooler than long sleeve if UV scrapes are not an issue.
Yeah, if you give workers the option, here's your polyester t-shirt or a cotton t-shirt, here's your 60 gram cotton, here's your 190 gram cotton, and here's your flame retardant and arc flash resistant clothing. They're going for the t-shirt every time where solar's not an issue. Even some that are exposed to solar would go for that t-shirt. Yeah, ideally, if solar wasn't an issue, the t-shirts are the go. We still see t-shirts being used in underground mining. Obviously, they've got the high vis, they're the right colour, and they've got the reflective strip, but there's no UV underground, so yeah, they're suitable down there.
Okay, only one more. Phil says, we often have workers complaining of sweating, but no other symptoms of heat, stress and strain. Is it too simplistic to suggest this is a natural response to heat and is more of a comfort issue as opposed to a health and safety risk? This is for short periods of work in mild to moderate temperatures, indoor work.
Yeah, that sounds like a natural response to fluctuation in body temp. Most of our workers will have a core temperature threshold for onset of sweating around 37.6, 37.7, 37.8. They're very, very mild core temperatures. So sweating is natural. I don't see it as being an issue. We need to see symptoms for it to be a little bit more serious and or high core temperatures. Given that it sounds like it's in moderate conditions and only for short periods, and there's a little bit of discomfort, not a great deal, I'd say that's work as normal. However, should they report heat rashes, which are due to blockage of the sweat gland, which are generally in areas where the PPE is rubbing across a sweat-soaked surface, that's an issue. But for short periods, I'd say work as normal.
Okay, well, I think we're done. I would like to thank you, Matt, for coming along, providing this expert advice. It's been great. There's a lot of comments from people too that I haven't read out saying it's been excellent. And we will send an email very soon with your email address and your website address, thermalperformance.com.au. And yes, thank you very much for that. And maybe we'll talk about another webinar on those strategies.
Let's do that. Sounds great.
All right. Thanks. Thank you, Matt. Bye, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Yeah.